In September of 1903, 13 black men signed papers incorporating a townsite company on a stretch of desert prairie about 15 miles south of Roswell, New Mexico. Their combined assets came to $10,000. The land they had chosen received between 12 and 13 inches of rain in a good year. There was no river within reach. The Pecos lay too far west to help them. There was no railroad, no road worth the name, and no town anywhere nearby that wanted them. They called it Black Dom. Within 5 years there were 25 families and roughly 300 people living on and around 15,000 acres of it. There was a blacksmith shop, a hotel, a Baptist church, a weekly newspaper. There was a man among them who would become the first African American to pass the New Mexico bar. There was a post office by 1912 and a school, and a teacher named Lloyd Allen who told the children that education was the thing nobody could take off them. Today there is nothing there, not a wall, not a chimney, not a fence post. The only physical trace of Black Dom, New Mexico, is a concrete slab in the dirt, barely visible, that used to be the floor of the schoolhouse. To reach it you take Highway 285 out of Roswell, then Chaves County Road 130, then a series of unpaved two-track roads across terrain the State Historic Preservation Division describes, in its own paperwork, as challenging. Some of those roads run across private land. You need permission. How a town gets built in a place with no water is one question. How it disappears so completely that a state task force has to be convened to figure out how to physically reach the spot where it stood is another. The answers are connected, and they run through a well, an infestation of worms, a company that never found what it was drilling for, and a family that walked 2,000 miles to get there. Start with the walk. Start earlier than that, actually. Start in 1846 with a wagon. Henry Boyer was a freedman from Pelham, Georgia. In 1846, during the war with Mexico, he signed on as a wagoner with the army units moving west under Stephen W. Kearny, Alexander Doniphan's Missouri Volunteers among them. That job took him across country that most people in Georgia had never heard of and would never see. He drove through the territory that would become New Mexico, and he noticed something about it that he did not forget. There was less of it, less of the thing that made Georgia what it was for a black man. Slavery was rare in New Mexico. During the Civil War, the territory would fall under a congressional ban on the expansion of it. The racial arrangement out there was its own complicated mess. Texas cattlemen against Nuevo Mexicano sheep herders, a whole set of grievances that had nothing to do with him. But the specific machinery of the Deep South, the one Henry Boyer had grown up inside, was not running at full speed in the Pecos Valley. He went home to Pelham. He never went back to New Mexico, but he told his children about it, over and over for the rest of his life. And one of those children was listening. Frank Boyer, Francis Marion Boyer, was educated at Morehouse and then at Fisk, two of the best black colleges in the country. He came out of them a teacher and a minister, and somewhere in the course of his schooling he studied the legal requirements of the Homestead Act, which is a strange thing for a young Georgia schoolteacher to bother learning unless he was already thinking about something. He went to work teaching in Georgia. He also started doing something considerably more dangerous than teaching. He began encouraging black Georgians to report abuses, to name what was being done to them and challenge it, in a state and a decade where that was very nearly a form of suicide. The Ku Klux Klan noticed. They threatened his life. His father, who had driven a wagon across the New Mexico territory half a century earlier, told him to go west. So he did, on foot. In 1896, some accounts put it at 1900, and the record on the exact year is not clean, Frank Boyer left Georgia and walked to New Mexico. It is nearly 2,000 miles. He went with two other men, both of them former students, Daniel Keyes, who would go on to marry Frank's twin sister Frances, and a man remembered only by the surname Ragsdale. They had no money to speak of. They picked up day labour along the way, working for a few dollars here and there, and moving on, When they finally got to the Pecos Valley, they took jobs in Roswell as cooks and ranch hands and saved what they could. In October of 1900, Frank Boyer and Daniel Keyes drilled a well. Remember that well. Everything that follows comes out of it, and eventually everything that follows goes back into it. What they had hit was the Roswell Artesian Basin, an underground reservoir under that stretch of desert, pressurized, so that when you punched a hole down into it, the water came up on its own. No pump, no windmill. You drilled and the water rose out of the ground and ran. In a country that got 12 inches of rain a year, an artesian well was not a convenience. It was the entire difference between a farm and a patch of sand. Ella Boyer arrived around the same time. She was a teacher too, a graduate of the Haynes Institute, and she came out with the first 7 of the 11 children she and Frank would eventually have. The family that would define the place was on the ground. In September of 1903, 13 African-American men, Frank Boyer and Isaac Jones among them, incorporated the Blackdom Townsite Company with $10,000 in combined assets. They named Boyer president. The town site itself was 40 acres. The community, in practice, sprawled across a much larger area of individual homesteads, some of them belonging to white farmers too, all of it loosely organized around the Boyer house. Frank advertised. He took out notices in newspapers around the country aimed at African-American families, and they came from Georgia, from Mississippi, from the Midwest, from Texas. They came out of sharecropping. They came out of towns where somebody had made it clear they were not welcome to stay. They came, in a few cases, out of Roswell itself, where white hostility toward black residents was sharpening in exactly those years. They were, most of them, farmers who had learned to farm in wet country, Georgia, Mississippi, places with rain and green and soil that behaved. What they got in Chavez County was calcareous ground, alkali, and 12 inches of water a year falling out of the sky. They farmed it anyway. The list of what came out of that dirt is longer than it has any business being. Alfalfa, apples, sorghum, beans, potatoes, cotton, cantaloupe, onions, sugar beets. Frank Boyer ran the largest hay harvest business in Dexter, New Mexico. They dry farmed, they irrigated off the artesian wells, and they brought Southern and African agricultural knowledge into a valley that had never seen it applied. The homestead process was specific and it was brutal. To prove up a claim, you had to establish actual residence on the land, build a house on it, and farm it for 3 years. Only then did it become yours. 3 years is a long time to feed a family off ground that has not yet produced anything, which is why the pattern in Blackdom looked the way it did. The men left. Repeatedly, a homesteader would leave his wife and children out on an unimproved claim in the desert and go take wage work in Roswell or Dexter or wherever there was cash to fund the farm that was supposed to make him independent. Crutcher Eubank did it. Most of them did it. They also did it as a family system, which is the part that shows how organized this was. Frank Boyer and Daniel Keyes started their homestead processes on the same day in 1905. They completed their patents on the same day, June 11th, 1908, on a contiguous 320 acres near the Pecos River in Dexter. The Boyer family collectively came to own more than 5 square miles. By 1908, there were around 300 people. The National Park Service, working from the surviving records, puts the resident figure closer to 150. The exact population of Blackdom is unknown and probably always will be. What is documented is the infrastructure: the post office, the store, a pumping plant, an office building, the blacksmith, the hotel, the weekly newspaper, the Baptist church. The school started inside the church and moved out of it. By 1915, at the height of the town's revival, they built the church a proper building. W.T. Malone came from Mississippi and became the first African American to pass the New Mexico bar exam. He was living in Black Dom. 12 women homesteaded there. Several of them did it alone, in their own names, on their own claims, in the desert, in the 19-teens. Ella Boyer proved up 160 acres adjoining the 40-acre town site that her husband had patented. And then there is Mittie Moore Wilson. Mittie Moore Wilson ran a house of prostitution about 20 miles north of Blackdom in Roswell. She was a bootlegger. She was also, by the accounts that survive, one of the wealthiest black residents in the entire area, and on February 25, 1922, she completed proving documents on a full square mile of land, 640 acres, on the south side of the Blackdom Commons. She held that land under 2 different land laws. The town's founder, a Morehouse and Fisk-educated Baptist minister and former Buffalo soldier, filed a homestead patent for the Blackdom town square using assignee rights that came partly through Mittie Moore. Nobody in Blackdom appears to have found this remarkable enough to write down at length. The frontier was a place where the arithmetic of survival ran ahead of the arithmetic of respectability, and a madam with 640 acres was, first and foremost, a landowner. Blackdom, in 1915, was working, not rich. Nobody out there was rich, but working. The wells ran. The alfalfa came in. The children went to school. There was a newspaper, which meant there was news, which meant there was a town. Then came 1916, and it came from 3 directions at once. The first was the worms. An infestation went through the crops and destroyed the apple harvest. Apples had been one of the 2 things Boyer and Keyes planted first, back at the beginning, because the early yields had been good enough to prove the site would work. In 1916, the apples were gone. The second was the soil. Alkali had been building up in the ground for years, the slow chemical consequence of irrigating dry country, salts accumulating with every watering until the dirt turns against the crop. That is not a thing you can see happening. It is a thing you notice has happened. The third was the water. The Roswell Artesian Basin had 1 flaw, and it was the same flaw that made it a miracle. The pressure was finite. Every well drilled into it drew on the same reservoir. Blackdom's neighbours drilled. The valley drilled. Farm after farm punched down into the basin, and each hole let a little more of the pressure out, and the water that had once come up on its own started coming up slower, and then it started not coming up at all. By 1920, the water had stopped flowing from the wells. So many had been drilled that the basin could no longer push it to the surface. The artesian era in the Pecos Valley was simply over. Blackdom's response was the obvious one: drill another well. And here, the state of New Mexico closed the last door. In the early 1920s, a law was passed banning further drilling for water. It was, from a resource management standpoint, a reasonable law. From Blackdom's standpoint, it meant the town could not do the one thing that had created it in the first place. They had walked 2,000 miles to a place where water came out of the ground by itself, and the ground had stopped. Then 1917 arrived and took the young men. America entered the war. The draft came, and at the same time, Roswell was hiring. Wages, in cash, right now 20 miles up the road. No 3-year proving period required. Francis L. Boyer, Frank and Ella's son, had filed his own homestead entry, number 034394, at the Roswell Land Office, March 30th, 1916, for 160 acres. He established residence that September. He built a 2-room house, a chicken coop, and a corral, and put 20 acres under cultivation and planted sugarcane and beans, and the drought took most of the yield. Then the army took him. He served in France as a private first class while his homestead sat out there in the sand. Settlers began leaving. Roswell, Dexter, Las Cruces. Not in a stampede, in a drip. And then, in 1919, oil. Oil had first been found in southeastern New Mexico in 1907. It earned the region a nickname, Little Texas, and it brought speculators down from Denver and out from New York and California, buying leases, sinking exploratory wells, chasing the possibility that the Permian country ran further north than anybody had proved. The people of Black Dom had a great deal of one thing: land. Dry, alkaline, worthless for farming land. And underneath it, possibly something. So they pooled it. Prominent families. The Boyers, the Ragsdales, the Eubanks, the Gateses, the Collinses agreed to deposit their land with the Roswell Picacho Investment Company to open it for exploration. On December 31st, 1919, the Roswell Daily Record reported the incorporation of the Black Dom Oil Company. The holdings came to something like 10,000 acres. In January 1920, they ran an advertisement in the same paper. "We'll drill at Black Dom." It was an invitation to wildcatters. Come look at what we have. The reason this worked, the reason a group of failing black farmers could suddenly negotiate with national oil interests, is that they had incorporated. They had a company. They had a legal entity that could hold leases and sign contracts. And behind that corporate veil, they were not 13 black homesteaders in a state that had opinions about black homesteaders. They were the Black Dom Oil Company, controlling lease rights to 10,000 acres. In March 1920, the Black Dom Oil Company entered a contract with the National Exploration Company covering 4,200 acres in a deal worth up to $70,000. In today's money, that is around $1 million. On September 1st, 1920, the Roswell Daily Record reported that an unidentified California outfit had made a location at Black Dom. In May of 1920, Frank and Ella Boyer filed the official plat for the town of Black Dom. It is a real document. It shows a surveyed grid, blocks, streets, alleys, a town square in the centre. 20 years after two men drilled a well in the desert, somebody had drawn the whole thing out properly on paper, with the streets named, like a place that intended to be there in 100 years. That plat is the high water mark of Black Dom, and it is also precisely the beginning of the end for a reason nobody at the time seems to have said out loud. Once the town was officially platted and incorporated, the county, the state, and the federal government could assess property values on it and tax them. The wells came in dry. Not empty, exactly. The number of wells sunk and barrels produced by the Black Dom venture is lost to history, and some of the families did collect royalties. The Ragsdales stayed and took royalty income off a well on their property, but the fields were not commercially viable. There was no Gusher, no Boom, no Little Texas moving north to Chavez County. Oil exploration in the Roswell Basin wound down and stopped. The first genuinely successful commercial wells in southeastern New Mexico started producing in 1922. Somewhere else. So the arithmetic of Black Dom at the end went like this. The land would not grow crops because the worms and the alkali and the vanished water had beaten it. The land would not produce oil because the oil was not there. But the land had produced, one time, a lease contract and a scatter of royalty checks. And that money, the money paid for the possibility of oil underground that had already refused to give them water, was enough that Frank and Ella Boyer, Daniel Keyes, and a number of other Black Domites were no longer obligated to stay on the land they had spent 20 years breaking themselves against. The thing that killed the town also paid for the exit. In 1921, the Boyers' house was foreclosed on. The family moved to Vado, New Mexico, in the Mesilla Valley, about 15 miles south of Las Cruces. Better land, easier water, a fresh start. Frank kept driving back to Chavez County anyway. He went to see family. He went to Masonic meetings. And he went to pick up his royalty checks. Vado is the part of this that does not get told, and it is the reason the word failure does not sit right on Black Dom. The Boyers did not quit. They took the same idea, a black town self-governing on land they owned, and they built it again in a valley that had water. For a while, Vardo's schools and churches and businesses were run by black families. Frank's brothers came. They lived on the same street. Vardo is still there. About 2,700 people live in it today. Francis L. Boyer, the son, the WWI veteran, the man whose sugarcane died in the drought of 1916, was still going in 1977. He was farming. He ran a garage on the side and did occasional work for friends. And he helped keep the town's water supply running. That is the second time water runs through this family's story, and the second time it is the whole story. Meanwhile, the paperwork on Black Dom kept grinding forward for years after the people had gone. By 1929, Black Dom residents had received homestead patents on 64 claims. Some had filed for 160 acres under the Homestead Act. Others took 320 under the Enlarged Homestead Act, or the Stock Raising Homestead Act, or the Desert Lands Act. Together, those 64 claims covered 13,056 acres, an average of 204 acres per claim, legally proven, patented, owned outright by black families in the American West. A great deal of it was empty by the time the ink dried. Then the Depression came, and gold mine towns survived it, and farm towns did not, and Black Dom was a farm town without a farm. The community did not survive the 1930s. In 1925, somebody took a photograph of a Sunday school class at the Black Dom Baptist Church. It is one of the last images of the place, as a going concern. The desert took it back with the efficiency of a machine designed for exactly that. The buildings were wood and adobe, and there was no one to maintain them, and the wind in Chaves County does not stop. The grassland that had drawn the homesteaders, the good years, the wet years, the string of seasons that fooled everyone into thinking this could work, reverted to Chihuahuan desert scrub, which is what it had been before and what it wanted to be. Newspapers wrote Black Dom up as a failed social experiment, and the phrase stuck. And it has been repeated for a century by people who mean no particular harm by it. It is a strange way to describe what happened. 150 people, most of them one generation out of slavery, walked or rode into a desert that got 12 inches of rain a year and drilled a well and built a town with a newspaper and a lawyer and a post office and a school, and held it for 20 years and proved up 64 legal land patents, covering 20 square miles. And when the water ran out, they incorporated an oil company and negotiated a $70,000 contract with a national exploration firm, and then they took the money and built a second town somewhere better. And that one is still standing. If that is failure, the word has lost its meaning somewhere along the way. On October 26, 2002, the governor of New Mexico proclaimed Black Dom Day. A historical marker went up at a rest stop on Highway 285 between Roswell and Artesia, which is a strange and fitting place for it. Travellers pulling off the road for 2 minutes, reading a plaque about a town that is not visible from anywhere. Former residents came. Descendants came. There were people alive in 2002 who had been children in Black Dom. The New Mexico State Highway and Transportation Authority has directed archaeological work on the homestead. In 2023, the State Senate passed a memorial requesting a task force to figure out how to gain access to the town site because the roads to it are dirt 2 tracks, and some run through private property, and the site is deteriorating. And the state's own assessment is that getting to it presents challenging terrain. There is a resolution on file in the legislature of the state of New Mexico, whose purpose is to work out how to physically reach a town that the state itself recognizes as culturally significant. That is what is left of the administrative history of Black Dom, a request for permission to visit it. The historian Timothy E. Nelson has spent years pulling the documents back out. The plats, the oil company filings, the Roswell Daily Record notices, the homestead entries, and he calls what happened out there the Black Dom Renaissance, and the wider thing, it belonged to the Afro-frontier. There were black towns like this across the West, and most people have never heard of any of them. Nicodemus in Kansas, Deerfield in Colorado, Boley and Langston in Oklahoma, Black Dom in New Mexico, places where the plan was not to integrate a town, but to build one. Drive south out of Roswell today on 285 and you will pass the rest stop with the marker. Keep going, then turn off onto County Road 130 and then onto the dirt and drive across the scrub with the Chihuahuan brush scraping the underside of the vehicle, and eventually you'll come to an open piece of desert that looks precisely like every other open piece of desert in Chaves County. Somewhere in it is a concrete slab, barely visible, mostly buried. It is the foundation of the schoolhouse, the one they built for the children, the one Lloyd Allen taught in, the one that started inside the church and then got a building of its own, because a town that means to last needs somewhere to put its children in the daytime. Under all of it, several hundred feet down, the Roswell Artesian Basin is still there. The water never left. It just stopped coming up on its own.